War and Peace, Book 1, Chapter 15. Read for LibriVox.org by Kristen Luoma. greenkri.com. "My dear Boris," said Princess Anna Mikhalovna to her son, as Countess Rostova's carriage, in which they were seated, drove over the straw-covered street and turned into the wide courtyard of Count Cyril Vladimirovitch Bezúkhov's house. "My dear Boris," said the mother, drawing her hand from beneath her old mantle and laying it timidly and tenderly on her son's arm. "Be affectionate and attentive to him. Count Cyril Vladimirovitch is your godfather after all. Your future depends on him. Remember that, my dear, and be nice to him, as you so well know how to be." "If only I knew that anything besides humiliation would come of it," answered her son coldly. "But I have promised, and will do it for your sake." Although the hall porter saw someone's carriage standing at the entrance, after scrutinizing the mother and son, who, without asking to be announced, had passed straight through the glass porch between the rows of statues and niches, and looking significantly at the lady's old cloak, he asked whether they wanted the count or the princesses, and hearing that they wished to see the count, said His Excellency was worse today, and that His Excellency was not receiving anyone. "We may as well go back," said the son in French. "My dear!" exclaimed his mother imploringly, again laying her hand on his arm, as if that touch might soothe or rouse him. Borís said no more, but looked inquiringly at his mother without taking off his cloak. "My friend," said Anna Mikhalovna in gentle tones, addressing the hall porter, "I know Count Cyril Vladimirovitch is very ill. That's why I have come. I am a relation. I shall not disturb him, my friend. I only need see Prince Vasíli Sergéevich. He is staying here, is he not? Please announce me." The hall porter sullenly pulled a bell that rang upstairs and turned away. "Princess Drubetskaya to see Prince Vasíli Sergéevich," he called to a footman dressed in knee breeches, shoes, and a swallow-tail coat, who ran downstairs and looked over from the hallway landing. The mother smoothed the folds of her dyed silk dress before a large Venetian mirror in the wall, and in her trodden-down shoes briskly ascended the carpeted stairs. "My dear," she said to her son, once more stimulating him by a touch, "you promised me." The son, lowering his eyes, followed her quietly. They entered the large hall from which one of the doors led to the apartments assigned to Prince Vasíli. Just as the mother and son, having reached the middle of the hall, were about to ask their way of an elderly footman who had sprung up as they entered, the bronze handle of one of the doors turned and Prince Vasíli came out, wearing a velvet coat with a single star on his breast, as was his custom when at home, taking leave of a good-looking, dark-haired man. This was the celebrated Petersburg doctor, Lorrain. "Then it is certain?" said the prince. "Prince, humanum est errar. Begin translation note. To err is human. End translation note." "But," replied the doctor, swallowing his r's and pronouncing the Latin words with a French accent. "Very well, very well." Seeing Anna Mikhalovna and her son, Prince Vasíli dismissed the doctor with a bow and approached them silently with a look of inquiry. The son noticed that an expression of profound sorrow suddenly clouded his mother's face, and she smiled slightly. "Ah, Prince! In what sad circumstances we meet again! And how is our dear invalid?" said she, as though unaware of the cold, offensive look fixed on her. Prince Vasíli stared at her and at Borís questioningly and perplexed. Borís bowed politely. Prince Vasíli, without acknowledging the bow, turned to Anna Mikhalovna, answering her query by a movement of the head and lips indicating very little hope for the patient. "Is it possible?" exclaimed Anna Mikhalovna. "Oh, how awful! It is terrible to think... This is my son," she added, indicating Borís. "He wanted to thank you himself." Borís bowed again politely. "Believe me, Prince, a mother's heart will never forget what you have done for us." "I am glad I was able to do you a service, my dear Anna Mikhalovna," said Prince Vasíli, arranging his lace frill, and in tone and manner here in Moscow to Anna Mikhalovna, whom he had placed under an obligation, assuming an air of much greater importance than he had done in Petersburg at Anna Scherer's reception. "Try to serve yourself well and show yourself worthy," added he, addressing Borís with severity. "I am glad. Are you here on leave?" He went on in his usual tone of indifference. "I am awaiting orders to join my new regiment, your excellency," replied Borís, betraying neither annoyance at the prince's brusque manner nor a desire to enter into conversation, but speaking so quietly and respectfully that the prince gave him a searching glance. "Are you living with your mother?" "I am living at Countess Rostóva's," replied Borís, again adding "your excellency." "That is, with Ilyá Rostov, who married Natalie Shinshina," said Anna Mikhalovna. I know," answered Prince Vasíli in his monotonous voice. "I never could understand how Natalie made up her mind to marry that unlicked bear. A perfectly absurd and stupid fellow, and a gambler too, I am told." "But a very kind man, Prince," said Anna Mikhalovna with a pathetic smile, as though she too knew that Count Rostóv deserved this censure, but asked him not to be too hard on the poor old man. "What do the doctors say?" asked the princess after a pause, her worn face again expressing deep sorrow. "They give little hope," replied the prince. "And I should so like to thank Uncle once for all his kindness to me and Borís. He is his godson," she added, her tone suggesting that this fact ought to give Prince Vasíli much satisfaction. Prince Vasíli became thoughtful and frowned. Anna Mikhalovna saw that he was afraid of finding in her a rival for Count Bezúkhov's fortune, and hastened to reassure him. "If it were not for my sincere affection and devotion to Uncle," said she, uttering the word with peculiar assurance and unconcern. "I know his character, noble and upright. But you see he has no one with him except the young princesses. They are still young." She bent her head and continued in a whisper. "Has he performed his final duty, Prince? How priceless are those last moments! It can make things no worse, and it is absolutely necessary to prepare him if he is so ill. We women, Prince," she smiled tenderly, "always know how to say these things. I absolutely must see him, however painful it may be for me. I am used to suffering." Evidently the prince understood her, and also understood, as he had done at Anna Pávlovna's, that it would be difficult to get rid of Anna Mikháylovna. "Would not such a meeting be too trying for him, dear Anna Mikháylovna?" said he. "Let us wait until evening. The doctors are expecting a crisis." "But one cannot delay, Prince, at such a moment. Consider that the welfare of his soul is at stake. Ah, it is awful, the duties of a Christian." A door of one of the inner rooms opened, and one of the princesses, the count's niece, entered with a cold, stern face. The length of her body was strikingly out of proportion to her short legs. Prince Vasíli turned to her. "Well, how is he?" "Still the same, but what can you expect? This noise," said the princess, looking at Anna Mikháylovna as at a stranger. "Ah, my dear, I hardly knew you," said Anna Mikháylovna with a happy smile, ambling lightly up to the count's niece. "I have come and am at your service to help you nurse my uncle. I imagine what you have gone through." And she sympathetically turned up her eyes. The princess gave no reply and did not even smile, but left the room as Anna Mikháylovna took off her gloves and, occupying the position she had conquered, settled down in an armchair, inviting Prince Vasíli to take a seat beside her. "Borís," she said to her son with a smile, "I shall go in to see the count, my uncle. But you, my dear, had better go to Pierre meanwhile, and don't forget to give him the Rostóvs' invitation. They ask him to dinner. I suppose he won't go?" she continued, turning to the prince. "On the contrary," replied the prince, who had plainly become depressed. "I shall only be too glad if you relieve me of that young man. Here he is, and the count has not once asked for him." He shrugged his shoulders. A footman conducted Borís down one flight of stairs and up another, to Pierre's rooms. End of chapter 15. Book 1, Chapter 16, read for LibriVox.org by Kristen Luoma, greenkri.com. Pierre, after all, had not managed to choose a career for himself in Petersburg, and had been expelled from there for riotous conduct and sent to Moscow. The story told about him at Count Rostóv's was true. Pierre had taken part in tying a policeman to a bear. He had now been for some days in Moscow and was staying as usual at his father's house. Though he expected that the story of his escapade would already be known in Moscow, and that the ladies about his father, who were never favorably disposed towards him, would have used it to turn the count against him, he nevertheless, on the day of his arrival, went to his father's part of the house. Entering the drawing-room where the princesses spent most of their time, he greeted the ladies, two of whom were sitting at embroidery frames, while a third read aloud. It was the eldest who was reading, the one who had met Anna Mikhaïlovna. The two younger ones were embroidering. Both were rosy and pretty, and they differed only in that one had a little mole on her lip, which made her much prettier. Pierre was received as if he were a corpse or a leper. The eldest princess paused in her reading and silently stared at him with frightened eyes. The second assumed precisely the same expression, while the youngest, the one with the mole, who was of a cheerful and lively disposition, bent over her frame to hide a smile, probably evoked by the amusing scene she foresaw. She drew her wool down through the canvas, and, scarcely able to refrain from laughing, stooped as if trying to make out the pattern. "How do you do, cousin?" said Pierre. "You don't recognize me?" "I recognize you only too well, too well." "How is the count? Can I see him?" asked Pierre, awkwardly as usual, but unabashed. "The count is suffering physically and mentally, and apparently you have done your best to increase his mental sufferings." "Can I see the count?" Pierre again asked. If you wish to kill him outright, you can see him. Olga, go and see whether Uncle's beef tea is ready. It is almost time," she added, giving Pierre to understand that they were busy making his father comfortable, while evidently he, Pierre, was only busy causing him annoyance. Olga went out. Pierre stood looking at the sisters. Then he bowed and said, "Then I will go to my rooms. You will let me know when I can see him." And he left the room, followed by the low but ringing laughter of the sister with the mole. Next day Prince Vasíli had arrived and settled in the count's house. He sent for Pierre and said to him, "My dear fellow, if you are going to behave here as you did in Petersburg, you will end very badly. That is all I have to say to you. The count is very, very ill, and you must not see him at all." Since then Pierre had not been disturbed and had spent the whole time in his rooms upstairs. When Borís appeared at his door, Pierre was pacing up and down his room, stopping occasionally at a corner to make menacing gestures at the wall, as if running a sword through an invisible foe, and glaring savagely over his spectacles, and then again resuming his walk, muttering indistinct words, shrugging his shoulders and gesticulating. "England is done for," said he, scowling and pointing his finger at someone unseen. "Mr. Pitt, as a traitor to the nation and to the rights of man, is sentenced to..." But before Pierre, who at that moment imagined himself to be Napoleon in person, and to have just effected the dangerous crossing of the Straits of Dover and captured London. Could pronounce sentence. He saw a well-built and handsome young officer entering his room. Pierre paused. He had left Moscow when Borís was a boy of 14 and had quite forgotten him, but in his usual impulsive and hearty way he took Borís by the hand with a friendly smile. "Do you remember me?" asked Borís quietly with a pleasant smile. "I have come with my mother to see the count, but it seems he is not well." "Yes, it seems he is ill. People are always disturbing him," answered Pierre, trying to remember who this young man was. Borís felt that Pierre did not recognize him, but did not consider it necessary to introduce himself. Without experiencing the least embarrassment, looked Pierre straight in the face. "Count Rostóv asks you to come to dinner today," said he, after a considerable pause, which made Pierre feel uncomfortable. "Ah, Count Rostóv!" exclaimed Pierre joyfully. "Then you are his son, Ilyá. Only fancy, I didn't know you at first. Do you remember how we went to the Sparrow Hills with Madame Jacquot? It's such an age!" "You are mistaken," said Borís deliberately, with a bold and slightly sarcastic smile. "I am Borís, son of Princess Anna Mikháylovna Drubetskaya. Rostov, the father, is Ilyá, and his son is Nicholas. I never knew any Madame Jacquot." Pierre shook his head and arms as if attacked by mosquitoes or bees. "Oh dear, what am I thinking about? I've mixed everything up. One has so many relatives in Moscow. So you are Borís, of course. Well, now we know where we are. And what do you think of the Bologna Expedition? The English will come off badly, you know, if Napoleon gets across the Channel. I think the expedition is quite feasible, if only Villeneuve doesn't make a mess of things." Borís knew nothing about the Bologna Expedition. He did not read the papers, and it was the first time he had heard Villeneuve's name. "We here in Moscow are more occupied with dinner parties and scandal than with politics," he said in his quiet, ironical tone. "I know nothing about it and have not thought about it. Moscow is chiefly busy with gossip," he continued. "Just now they are talking about you and your father." Pierre smiled in his good-natured way, as if afraid for his companion's sake that the latter might say something he would afterwards regret. But Borís spoke distinctly, clearly and dryly, looking straight into Pierre's eyes. "Moscow has nothing else to do but gossip," Borís went on. "Everybody is wondering to whom the count will leave his fortune, though he may perhaps outlive us all, and I sincerely hope he will." "Yes, it is all very horrid," interrupted Pierre. "Very horrid." Pierre was still afraid that this officer might inadvertently say something disconcerting to himself. "And it must seem to you," said Borís, flushing slightly, but not changing his tone or attitude, "it must seem to you that everyone is trying to get something out of the rich man." "So it does," thought Pierre. "But I wish to say, to avoid misunderstandings, that you are quite mistaken if you reckon me or my mother among such people. We are very poor, but for my own part, at any rate, for the very reason that your father is rich, I don't regard myself as a relation of his, and neither I nor my mother would ever ask or take anything from him." For a long time Pierre could not understand, but when he did, he jumped up from the sofa, seized Borís under the elbow in his quick, clumsy way, and, blushing far more than Borís, began to speak with a feeling of mingled shame and vexation. "Well, this is strange. Do you suppose who could think? I know very well..." But Borís again interrupted him. "I am glad I have spoken out fully. Perhaps you did not like it? You must excuse me," said he, putting Pierre at ease instead of being put at ease by him. "But I hope I have not offended you. I always make a rule to speak out, well, What answer am I to take? Will you come to dinner at the Rostovs'?" And Borís, having apparently relieved himself of an onerous duty and extricated himself from an awkward situation and placed another in it, became quite pleasant again. "No, but I say," said Pierre, calming down, "you are a wonderful fellow. What you have just said is good, very good. Of course you don't know me. We have not met for such a long time, not since we were children. You might think that I understand, quite understand. I could not have done it myself. I should not have had the courage, but it's splendid. I am very glad to have made your acquaintance. It's queer," he added after a pause, "that you should have suspected me." He began to laugh. "Well, what of it? I hope we'll get better acquainted." And he pressed Borís' hand. "Do you know, I have not once been in to see the count. He has not sent for me. I am sorry for him as a man, but what can one do?" "And so you think Napoleon will manage to get an army across?" asked Borís with a smile. Pierre saw that Borís wished to change the subject, and being of the same mind he began explaining the advantages and disadvantages of the Bologna Expedition. A footman came in to summon Borís. The princess was going. Pierre, in order to make Borís' better acquaintance, promised to come to dinner, and warmly pressing his hand looked affectionately over his spectacles into Borís' eyes. After he had gone, Pierre continued pacing up and down the room for a long time, no longer piercing an imaginary foe with his imaginary sword, but smiling at the remembrance of that pleasant, intelligent, and resolute young man. As often happens in early youth, especially to one who leads a lonely life, he felt an unaccountable tenderness for this young man and made up his mind that they should be friends. Prince Vasíli saw the princess off. She held a handkerchief to her eyes, and her face was tearful. "It is dreadful, dreadful," she was saying. "But cost me what it may, I shall do my duty. I will come and spend the night. He must not be left like this. Every moment is precious. I can't think why his nieces put it off. Perhaps God will help me to find a way to prepare him. Adieu, Prince. May God support you." "Adieu, ma bonne," answered Prince Vasíli, turning away from her. "Oh, he is in a dreadful state," said the mother to her son when they were in the carriage. "He hardly recognizes anybody." "I don't understand, Mamma. What is his attitude to Pierre?" asked the son. "The will show that, my dear. Our fate also depends on it." "But why do you expect that he will leave us anything?" "Ah, my dear, he is so rich, and we are so poor." "Well, that is hardly a sufficient reason, Mamma. Oh, heaven, how ill he is!" exclaimed the mother. End of chapter 16. Peace, Book 1, Chapter 17. Read for LibriVox.org by Kristen Luoma. greenkri.com. After Anna Mikhaïlovna had driven off with her son to visit Count Cyril Vladimirovich Bezúkhov, Countess Rostova sat for a long time all alone, applying her handkerchief to her eyes. And last she rang. "What is the matter with you, my dear?" she said crossly to the maid, who kept her waiting some minutes. "Don't you wish to serve me? Then I'll find you another place." The countess was upset by her friend's sorrow and humiliating poverty, and was therefore out of sorts, a state of mind which with her always found expression in calling her maid "my dear," and speaking to her with exaggerated politeness. "I am very sorry, ma'am," answered the maid. "Ask Count to come to me." The Count came waddling in to see his wife, with a rather guilty look as usual. "Well, little Countess? What a sauté of game au madère we are to have, my dear! I tasted it. The 1,000 roubles I'd paid for Taras were not ill spent. He is worth it." He sat down by his wife, his elbows on his knees and his hands ruffling his grey hair. "What are your commands, little Countess?" "You see, my dear... What's that mess?" she said, pointing to his waistcoat. "It's the sauté, most likely," she added with a smile. "Well, you see, Count, I want some money." Her face became sad. "Oh, little Countess!" And the Count began rustling to get out his pocketbook. "I want a great deal, Count. I want 500 roubles." And taking out her cambric handkerchief, she began wiping her husband's waistcoat. "Yes, immediately, immediately. Hey, who's there?" he called out in a tone only used by persons who are certain that those they call will rush to obey the summons. "Send Dmitri to me." Dmitri, a man of good family who had been brought up in the Count's house and now managed all his affairs, stepped softly into the room. "This is what I want, my dear fellow," said the Count to the deferential young man who had entered. "Bring me..." He reflected a moment. "Yes, bring me 700 roubles. Yes, but mind, don't bring me such tattered and dirty notes as last time, but nice and clean ones for the Countess." "Yes, Dmitri, clean ones, please," said the Countess, sighing deeply. "When would you like them, your Excellency?" asked Dmitri. "Allow me to inform you... But don't be uneasy," he added, noticing that the Count was beginning to breathe heavily and quickly, which was always a sign of approaching anger. "I was forgetting. Do you wish it brought at once?" "Yes, yes, just so. Bring it. Give it to the Countess." "What a treasure that Dmitri is!" added the Count with a smile when the young man had departed. "There is never any impossible with him. That's a thing I hate. Everything is impossible." "Ah, money, Count, money! How much sorrow it causes in the world!" said the Countess. "But I am in great need of this sum." "You, my little Countess, are a notorious spendthrift," said the Count, and having kissed his wife's hand, he went back to his study. When Anna Mikhalovna returned from Count Bezukhov's the money, all in clean notes, was lying ready under a handkerchief on the Countess's little table, and Anna Mikhalovna noticed that something was agitating her. "Well, my dear?" asked the Countess. "Oh, what a terrible state he is in! One would not know him, he is so ill. I was only there a few moments and hardly said a word." "Annette, for heaven's sake, don't refuse me," the Countess began, with a blush that looked very strange on her thin, dignified, elderly face, and she took the money from under the handkerchief. Anna Mikhalovna instantly guessed her intention and stopped to be ready to embrace the Countess at the appropriate moment. "This is for Boris from me, for his outfit." Anna Mikhalovna was already embracing her and weeping. The Countess wept too. They wept because they were friends, and because they were kind-hearted, and because they, friends from childhood, had to think about such a base thing as money, and because their youth was over. But those tears were pleasant to them both. End of chapter.
Book 1, Chapter 18, read for LibriVox.org by Gemma Blythe. Countess Rostova, with her daughters and a large number of guests, was already seated in the drawing-room. The Count took the gentlemen into his study and showed them his choice collection of Turkish pipes. From time to time he went out to ask, "Hasn't she come yet?" They were expecting Márya Dmítrievna Akhrosímova, known in society as the Terrible Dragon, a lady distinguished not for wealth or rank, but for common sense and frank plainness of speech. Maria Dmitrievna, was known to the imperial family as well as to our Moscow and Petersburg, and both cities wondered at her, laughed privately at her rudenesses, and told good stories about her, while none the less all without exception respected and feared her. In the count's room, which was full of tobacco smoke, they talked of war that had been announced in a manifesto and about the recruiting. None of them had yet seen the manifesto, but they all knew it had appeared. The count sat on the sofa between two guests who were smoking and talking. He neither smoked nor talked, but bending his head first to one side and then to the other, watched the smokers with evident pleasure, and listened to the conversation of his two neighbors, whom he egged on against each other. One of them was a sallow, clean-shaven civilian with a thin and wrinkled face, already growing old, though he was dressed like a most fashionable young man. He sat with his legs up on the sofa, as if quite at home, and having stuck an amber mouthpiece far into his mouth, was inhaling the smoke spasmodically and screwing up his eyes. This was an old bachelor, Shinshín, a cousin of the countess, a man with a sharp tongue, as they said in Moscow society. He seemed to be condescending to his companion. The latter, a fresh, rosy officer of the Guards, irreproachably washed, brushed, and buttoned, held his pipe in the middle of his mouth, and with red lips gently inhaled the smoke, letting it escape from his handsome mouth in rings. This was Lieutenant Berg, an officer in the Smemonov regiment, with whom Borís was to travel to join the army, and about whom Natásha had teased her elder sister Véra, speaking of Berg as her intended. The count sat between them and listened attentively. His favorite occupation, when not playing Boston, a card game he was very fond of, was that of listener, especially when he succeeded in setting two loquacious talkers at one another. "Well then, old chap, mon très honorable Alphonse Karlovich," said Shinshín, laughing ironically and mixing the most ordinary Russian expressions with the choicest French phrases, which was a peculiarity of his speech. "Vous comptez-vous faire de renseignements? You expect to make an income out of the government? You want to make something out of your company?" "No, Peter Nikolaevich. I only want to show that in the cavalry the advantages are far less than in the infantry. Just consider my own position now, Peter Nikolaevich." Berg always spoke quietly, politely, and with great precision. His conversation always related entirely to himself. He would remain calm and silent when the talk related to any topic that had no direct bearing on himself. He could remain silent for hours without being at all put out of countenance himself or making others uncomfortable. But as soon as the conversation concerned himself, he would begin to talk, circumstantially and with evident satisfaction. "Consider my position, Peter Nikolaevich. Were I in the cavalry, I should get not more than 200 rubles every 4 months, even with the rank of lieutenant. But as it is, I receive 230, said he, looking at Shinshín and the count with a joyful, pleasant smile, as if it were obvious to him that his success must always be the chief desire of everyone else. "Besides that, Peter Nikolaevich, by exchanging into the Guards I shall be in a more prominent position," continued Berg, "and vacancies occur much more frequently in the Foot Guards. Then just think what can be done with 230 rubles. I even managed to put a little aside and to send something to my father," he went on, emitting a smoke ring. "La balance y est, so that squares matters. A German knows how to skin a flint, as the proverb says," remarked Shinshín, moving his pipe to the other side of his mouth and winking at the count. The count burst out laughing. The other guests, seeing that Shinshín was talking, came up to listen. Berg, oblivious of irony or indifference, continued to explain how by exchanging into the Guards he had already gained a step on his old comrades of the Cadet Corps, how in wartime the company commander might get killed and he, as senior in the company, might easily succeed to the post, how popular he was with everyone in the regiment, and how satisfied his father was with him. Berg evidently enjoyed narrating all this, and did not seem to suspect that others too might have their own interests, but all he said was so prettily sedate, and the naivete of his youthful egotism was so obvious, that he disarmed his hearers. "Well, my boy, you'll get along wherever you go, foot or horse. That I'll warrant," said Shinshín, patting him on the shoulder and taking his feet off the sofa. Berg smiled joyously. The count, by his guests, went into the drawing-room. It was just the moment before a big dinner, when the assembled guests, expecting the summons to zakúska, avoid engaging in any long conversation, but think it necessary to move about and talk, in order to show that they are not at all impatient for their food. The host and hostess looked toward the door, and now and then glanced at one another, and the visitors tried to guess from these glances who or what they are waiting for: some important relation who has not yet arrived, or a dish that is not yet ready. Pierre has just come at dinner time, and was sitting awkwardly in the middle of the drawing-room on the first chair he had come across, blocking the way for everyone. The countess tried to make him talk, but he went on naively looking around through his spectacles as if in search of somebody, and answered all her questions in monosyllables. He was in the way, and was the only one who did not notice the fact. Most of the guests, knowing of the affair with the bear, looked with curiosity at this big, stout, quiet man, wondering how such a clumsy, modest fellow could have played such a prank on a policeman. "You have only lately arrived?" the countess asked him. "Oui, madame," replied he, looking around him. "You have not yet seen my husband?" "No, madame." He smiled quite inappropriately. "You have been in Paris recently, I believe. I suppose it's very interesting." "Very interesting." The countess exchanged glances with Anna Mikháylovna. The latter understood that she was being asked to entertain this young man, and sitting down beside him, she began to speak about his father, but he answered her, as he had the countess, only in monosyllables. The other guests were all conversing with one another. "The Razumóvskis, it was charming. You are very kind, Countess Apráksina," was heard on all sides. The countess rose and went into the ballroom. "Márya Dmítrievna," came her voice from there. "Herself," came the answer in a rough voice, and Márya Dmítrievna entered the room. All the unmarried ladies, and even the married ones, except the very oldest, rose. Márya Dmítrievna paused at the door. Tall and stout, holding high a 50-year-old head with its gray curls, she stood surveying the guests, and leisurely arranged her wide sleeves, as if rolling them up. Márya Dmítrievna always spoke in Russian. "Health and happiness to her, whose name-day we are keeping, and to her children," she said in her loud, full-toned voice, which drowned all others. "Well, you old sinner," she went on, turning to the count, who was kissing her hand, "you're feeling dull in Moscow?" "I dare say. Nowhere to hunt with your dogs. And what is to be done, old man? Just see how these nestlings are growing up," and she pointed to the girls. "You must look for husbands for them, whether you like it or not." "Well," said she, "how's my Cossack?" Márya Dmítrievna always called Natásha a Cossack, and she stroked the child's arm as she came up fearless and gay to kiss her hand. "I know she's a scamp of a girl, but I like her." She took a pair of pear-shaped ruby earrings from her huge reticule, and having given them to the rosy Natásha, who beamed with the pleasure of her saint's day fete, turned away at once and addressed herself to Pierre. "Hey, friend, come here a bit," said she, assuming a soft, high tone of voice. "Come here, my friend," and she ominously tucked up her sleeves still higher. Pierre approached, looking at her in a childlike way through his spectacles. Come nearer, friend. I used to be the only one to tell your father the truth when he was in favor, and in your case it's my evident duty." She paused. All were silent, expectant of what was to follow, for this was clearly only a prelude. "A fine lad, my word, a fine lad. His father lies on his deathbed, and he amuses himself, setting a policeman astride a bear. For shame, sir, for shame. It would be better if you went to the war." She turned away and gave her hand to the count, who could hardly keep from laughing. "Well, I suppose it is time we were at table," said Márya Dmítrievna. The count went in first with Márya Dmítrievna. The countess followed on the arm of a colonel of hussars, a man of importance to them because Nicholas was to go with him to the regiment. Then came Anna Mikháylovna with Shinshín. Berg gave his arm to Véra. The smiling Julie Karágina went in with Nicholas. After them other couples followed, filling the whole dining hall, and last of all the children, tutors and governesses, followed singly. The footmen began moving about, chairs scraped, the bands struck up in the gallery, and the guests settled down in their places. Then the strains of the count's household band were replaced by the clatter of knives and forks, the voices of visitors, and the soft steps of the footmen. At one end of the table sat the countess with Márya Dmítrievna on her right and Anna Mikháylovna on her left. The other lady visitors were farther down. At the other end sat the count, with the hussar colonel on his left and Shinshín and the other male visitors on his right. Midway down the long table on one side sat the grown-up young people, Véra beside Berg, and Pierre beside Borís, and on the other side the children, tutors and governesses. From behind the crystal decanters and fruit vases the count kept glancing at his wife and her tall cap with its light blue ribbons, and busily filled his neighbors' glasses, not neglecting his own. The countess, in turn, without omitting her duties as hostess, threw significant glances from behind the pineapples at her husband, whose face and bald head seemed by their redness to contrast more than usual with his gray hair. At the ladies' end an even chatter of voices was heard all the time. At the men's end the voices sounded louder and louder, especially that of the colonel of hussars, who, growing more and more flushed, ate and drank so much that the count held him up as a pattern to the other guests. Berg, with tender smiles, was saying to Véra that love is not an earthly but a heavenly feeling. Borís was telling his new friend Pierre who the guests were, and exchanging glances with Natásha, who was sitting opposite. Pierre spoke little, but examined the new faces and ate a great deal. Of the two soups he chose turtle with savory patties, and went on to the game without omitting a single dish or one of the wines. These latter the butler thrust mysteriously forward, wrapped in a napkin, from behind the next man's shoulders, and whispered, "Dry Madeira, Hungarian, or Rhine wine," as the case might be. Of the 4 crystal glasses engraved with the count's monogram that stood before his plate, Pierre held out one at random and drank with enjoyment, gazing with ever-increasing amiability at the other guests. Natásha, who sat opposite, was looking at Borís as girls of 13 look at the boy they are in love with and have just kissed for the first time. Sometimes that same look fell on Pierre, and that funny lively little girl's look made him inclined to laugh without knowing why. Nicholas sat at some distance from Sónya, beside Julie Karágina, to whom he was again talking with the same involuntary smile. Sónya wore a company smile, but was evidently tormented by jealousy. Now she turned pale, now blushed, and strained every nerve to overhear what Nicholas and Julie were saying to one another. The governess kept looking round uneasily, as if preparing to resent any slight that might be put upon the children. The German tutor was trying to remember all the dishes, wines, and kinds of dessert, in order to send a full description of the dinner to his people in Germany, and he felt greatly offended when the butler, with a bottle wrapped in a napkin, passed him by. He frowned, trying to appear as if he did not want any of that wine, but was mortified because no one would understand that it was not to quench his thirst or from greediness that he wanted it, but simply from a conscientious desire for knowledge. End of chapter 18.
War and Peace, Book 1, Chapter 19. Read for LibriVox.org by alexfoster.me.uk. At the men's end of the table, the talk grew more and more animated. The colonel told them that the declaration of war had already appeared in Petersburg, and that a copy, which he had himself seen, had that day been forwarded by courier to the commander-in-chief. "And why the deuce are we going to fight Bonaparte?" remarked Shinshín. "He has stopped Austria's cackle, and I fear it will be our turn next." The colonel was a stout, tall, plethoric German, evidently devoted to the service and patriotically Russian. He resented Shinshín's remarks. "It is for the reason, my good sir," said he, speaking with a German accent, "for the reason that the Emperor knows that. He declares in the manifesto that he cannot view with indifference the danger threatening Russia, and that the safety and dignity of the Empire, as well as the sanctity of its alliances—" He spoke this last word with particular emphasis, as if in it lay the gist of the matter. Then, with the unerring official memory that characterized him, he repeated from the opening words of the manifesto: "And the wish, which constitutes the Emperor's sole and absolute aim, to establish peace in Europe on firm foundations, has now decided him to dispatch part of the army abroad and to create a new condition for the attainment of that purpose. That, my dear sir, is why," he concluded, drinking a tumbler of wine with dignity, and looking to the count for approval. "Connaissez-vous le proverbe, Jerome, Jerome, do not roam, but turn spindles at home?" said Shinshín, suckering his brows and smiling. "Cela nous convient à merveille." Suvórov now, he knew what he was about, yet they beat him à plate couture, and where do we find Suvorovs now? "Je vous demande un peu," said he, continually changing from French to Russian. "We must fight to the last drop of our blood," said the colonel, thumping the table, "and we must die for our Emperor, and then all will be well. We must discuss it as little as possible." He dwelt particularly on the word possible. "As possible," he ended, again turning to the count. "That is how we old hussars look at it, and there's an end to it. And how do you, a young man and a young hussar, how do you judge it?" he added, addressing Nicholas, who, when he heard that the war was being discussed, had turned from his partner with eyes and ears intent on the colonel. "I am quite of your opinion," replied Nicholas, flaming up, turning his plate round and moving his wine-glass about with as much decision and desperation as though he were at that moment facing some great danger. "I am convinced that we Russians must die or conquer," he concluded, conscious, as were others, after the words were uttered, that his remarks were too enthusiastic and emphatic for the occasion, and were therefore awkward. "What you said just now was splendid," said his partner Julie. Sónya trembled all over and blushed to her ears and behind them and down to her neck and shoulders while Nicholas was speaking. Pierre listened to the colonel's speech and nodded approvingly. "That's fine," said he. "The young man's a real hussar!" shouted the colonel again, thumping the table. "What are you making such a noise about over there?" Márya Dmítrievna's deep voice suddenly inquired from the other end of the table. "What are you thumping the table for?" she demanded of the hussar. "And why are you exciting yourself? Do you think the French are here?" "I am speaking the truth," replied the hussar with a smile. "It's all about the war!" the count shouted down the table. "You know my son's going, Márya Dmítrievna. My son is going." "I have 4 sons in the army, but still I don't fret. It is all in God's hands. You may die in your bed, or God may spare you in a battle," replied Márya Dmítrievna's deep voice, which easily carried the whole length of the table. "That's true." Once more the conversations concentrated, the ladies at one end and the men's at the other. "You won't ask," Natásha's little brother was saying. "I know you won't ask." "I will," replied Natásha. Her face suddenly flushed with reckless and joyous resolution. She half rose, by a glance inviting Pierre, who sat opposite, to listen to what was coming, and turning to her mother, "Mamma!" rang out the clear contralto notes of her childish voice, audible the whole length of the table. "What is it?" asked the countess, startled. But seeing by her daughter's face that it was only mischief, she shook a finger at her sternly with a threatening and forbidding movement of her head. The conversation was hushed. "Mamma, what sweets are we going to have?" And Natásha's voice sounded still more firm and resolute. The countess tried to frown, but could not. Márya Dmítrievna shook her fat finger. "Cossack!" she said threateningly. Most of the guests, uncertain how to regard this sally, looked at the elders. "You had better take care," said the Countess. "Mamma, what sweets are we going to have?" Natásha again cried boldly, with saucy gaiety, confident that her prank would be taken in good part. Sónya and little fat Pétya doubled up with laughter. "You see, I have asked," whispered Natásha to her little brother and to Pierre, glancing at him again. "Ice pudding, but you won't get any," said Márya Dmítrievna. Natásha saw there was nothing to be afraid of, and so she braved even Márya Dmítrievna. "Márya Dmítrievna, what kind of ice pudding?" "I don't like ice cream." "Carrot ices." "No! What kind, Márya Dmítrievna? What kind?" she almost screamed. "I want to know." Márya Dmítrievna and the Countess burst out laughing, and all the guests joined in. Everyone laughed, not at Márya Dmítrievna's answer, but at the incredible boldness and smartness of this little girl who had dared treat Márya Dmítrievna in this fashion. Natásha only desisted when she had been told that there would be pineapple ice. Before the ices, champagne was served round. The band again struck up, the Count and Countess kissed, and the guests, leaving their seats, went up to congratulate the Countess, and reached across the table to clink glasses with the Count, with the children, and with one another. Again the footmen rushed about, chairs scraped, and in the same order in which they had entered, but with redder faces, the guests returned to the drawing-room and to the Count's study. End of chapter 19. Recorded in Nottingham, England by Alex Foster, www.alexfoster.me.uk, on the 18th of July 2006. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. A reading for LibriVox.org by alexfoster.me.uk. Chapter 20, Book 1. The card tables were drawn out, sets made up for Boston, and the Count's visitors settled themselves, some in the two drawing-rooms, some in the sitting-room, and some in the library. The Count, holding his cards fanwise, kept himself with difficulty from dropping into his usual after-dinner nap, and laughed at everything. The young people, at the Countess's instigation, gathered around the clavichord and harp. Julie, by general request, played first. After she had played a little air with variations on the harp, she joined with the other young ladies in begging Natásha and Nicholas, who were noted for their musical talent, to sing something. Natásha, who was treated as though she were grown up, was evidently very proud of this, but at the same time felt shy. "What shall we sing?" she said. "The Brook," suggested Nicholas. "Well then, let's be quick. Boris, come here," said Natásha. "But where is Sónya?" She looked around, and seeing that her friend was not in the room, ran to look for her. Running into Sónya's room and not finding her there, Natásha ran to the nursery, but Sónya was not there either. Natásha concluded that she must be on the chest in the passage. The chest in the passage was the place of mourning for the younger female generation in the Rostov household, and there in fact was Sónya lying face downwards on nurse's dirty feather bed on top of the chest, crumpling her gauzy pink dress under her, hiding her face with her slender fingers, and sobbing so convulsively that her bare little shoulders shook. Natásha's face, which had been so radiantly happy all that saint's day, suddenly changed. Her eyes became fixed, and then a shiver passed down her broad neck, and the corners of her mouth drooped. "Sónya, what is it? What is the matter? Oh, 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 oh!" And Natásha's large mouth widened, making her look very ugly, and she began to wail like a baby without knowing why, except that Sónya was crying. Sónya tried to lift her head to answer, but could not, and hid her face still deeper in the bed. Natásha wept, sitting on the blue-striped feather bed and hugging her friend. With an effort, Sónya sat up and began wiping her eyes and explaining. "Nicholas is going away in a week's time. His papers have come. He told me himself, but still I should not cry." And she showed a paper she held in her hand, with the verses Nicholas had written. "Still, I should not cry, but you can't. No one can understand what a soul he has." And she began to cry again because he had such a noble soul. "It's all very well for you. I'm not envious. I love you and Boris also," she went on, gaining a little strength. "He is nice. There are no difficulties in your way. But Nicholas is my cousin. One would have to... the Metropolitan himself. and even then it can't be done. And besides, if she tells Mamma—" Sónya looked upon the Countess as her mother and called her so— "that I am spoiling Nicholas's career and am heartless and ungrateful, well, truly, God is my witness," and she made the sign of the cross. "I love her so much, and all of you, only Vera, and what for? What have I done to her? I am so grateful to you that I would willingly sacrifice everything, only I have nothing." Sónya could not continue, and again hid her face in her hands and in the feather bed. Natásha began consoling her, but her face showed that she understood all the gravity of her friend's trouble. "Sónya," she suddenly exclaimed, as if she had guessed the true reason of her friend's sorrow, "I'm sure Vera has said something to you since dinner, hasn't she?" "Yes, these verses Nicholas wrote himself, and I copied some others, and she found them on my table and said she'd show them to Mamma, and that I was ungrateful, and that Mamma will never allow him to marry me, but that he'll marry Julie. You see how it's been with her all day. Natásha, what have I done to deserve it?" And again she began to sob, more bitterly than before. Natásha lifted her up, hugged her, and smiling through her tears, began comforting her. "Sónya, don't believe her, darling, don't believe her. Do you remember how we and Nicholas, all three of us, talked in the sitting-room after supper? Why, we settled how everything was to be. I don't quite remember how, but don't you remember that it could all be arranged, and how nice it all was? There's Uncle Shinshin's brother has married his first cousin, and we are only second cousins, you know, and Boris says it's quite possible. You know I have told him all about it, and he is so clever and so good," said Natásha. "Don't you cry, Sónya, dear love, darling Sónya." And she kissed her and laughed. "Vera's spiteful, never mind her. And all will come right, and she won't say anything to Mamma. Nicholas will tell her himself, and he doesn't care at all for Julie." Natásha kissed her on the hair. Sónya sat up. The little kitten brightened, its eyes shone, and it seemed ready to lift its tail, jump down upon its soft paws, and begin playing with the ball of worsted as a kitten should. Do you think so? Really? Truly?" she said, quickly smoothing her frock and hair. "Really, truly," answered Natásha, pushing in a crisp lock that had strayed from under her friend's plaits. Both laughed. "Well, let's go and sing the brook. Come along." "Do you know, that fat Pierre who sat opposite me is so funny," said Natásha, stopping suddenly. "I feel so happy." And she set off at a run along the passage. Sónya, shaking off some down which clung to her, and tucking away the verses in the bosom of her dress close to her bony little chest, ran after Natásha down the passage into the sitting-room with flushed face and light, joyous steps. At the visitor's request, the young people sang the quartet, "The Brook," with which everyone was delighted. And then Nicholas sang a song he had just learned. "At night-time in the moon's fair glow, how sweet, as fancies wander free, to feel that in this world there's one who still is thinking but of thee, that while her fingers touch the harp, wafting sweet music the lea, it is for thee thus swells her heart, sighing its message out to thee. A day or two, then bliss unspoiled, but oh, then I cannot live." He had not finished the last verse before the young people began to get ready to dance in the large hall, and the sound of the feet and the coughing of the musicians were heard from the gallery. Pierre was sitting in the drawing-room where Shinshin had engaged him, as a man recently returned from abroad, in a political conversation in which several others joined, but which bored Pierre. When the music began, Natásha came in and, walking straight up to Pierre, said, laughing and blushing, "Mamma told me to ask you to join the dancers." "I'm afraid of mixing the figures," Pierre replied, "but if you will be my teacher..." And lowering his big arm, he offered it to the slender little girl. While the couples were arranging themselves and the musicians tuning up, Pierre sat down with his little partner. Natásha was perfectly happy. She was dancing with a grown-up man who had been abroad. She was sitting in a conspicuous place and talking to him like a grown-up lady. She had a fan in her hand that one of the ladies had given her to hold. Assuming quite the pose of a society woman, heaven knows when and where she had learned it, she talked with her partner, fanning herself and smiling over the fan. "Dear, dear, just look at her!" exclaimed the countess as she crossed the ballroom, pointing to Natásha. Natásha blushed and laughed. "Well, really, mamma, why should you? What is there to be surprised at?" In the midst of the third écossaise there was a clatter of chairs being pushed back in the sitting-room where the Count and Márya Dmítrievna had been playing cards with the majority of the more distinguished and older visitors. They now, stretching themselves after sitting so long and replacing their purses and pocketbooks, entered the ballroom. First came Márya Dmítrievna and the Count, both with merry countenances. The Count, with playful ceremony somewhat in ballet style, offered his bent arm to Márya Dmítrievna. He drew himself up as a smile of debonair gallantry lit up his face, and as soon as the last figure of the écossaise was ended, he clapped his hands to the musicians and shouted up to the gallery, addressing the first violin, "Simon, do you know the Daniel Cooper?" This was the Count's favourite dance, which he had danced in his youth. Strictly speaking, Daniel Cooper was one figure of the Anglaise. "Look at Papa!" shouted Natásha to the whole company, and quite forgetting she was dancing with a grown-up partner, she bent her curly head to the knees and made the whole room ring with her laughter. And indeed everyone in the room looked with a smile of pleasure at the jovial old gentleman, who, standing behind his tall, stout partner, Márya Dmítrievna, curved his arms, beat time, straightened his shoulders, turned out his toes, tapped gently with his foot, and by a smile that broadened his round face more and more, prepared the onlookers for what was to follow. As soon as the provocatively gay strains of Daniel Cooper, somewhat resembling those of a merry peasant dance, began to sound, all the doorways of the ballroom were suddenly filled by the domestic serfs, the men on one side and the women on the other, who with beaming faces had come to see their master making merry. "Just look at the master, a regular eagle he is," loudly remarked the nurse as she stood in one of the doorways. The Count danced well and knew it, but his partner could not and did not want to dance well. Her enormous figure stood erect, her powerful arms hanging down. She had handed her reticule to the Countess, and only her stern but handsome face really joined in the dance. What was expressed by the whole of the Count's plump figure in Márya Dmítrievna found expression only in her more and more beaming face and quivering nose. But if the Count, getting more and more into the swing of it, charmed the spectators by the unexpectedness of his adroit maneuvers and the agility with which he capered about on his light feet, Márya Dmítrievna produced no less impression by slight exertions, the least effort to move her shoulders or bend her arms when turning, or stamp her foot, which everyone appreciated in view of her size and habitual severity. The dance grew livelier and livelier. The other couples could not attract a moment's attention to their own evolutions, and did not even try to do so. All were watching the Count and Márya Dmítrievna. Natásha kept pulling everyone by sleeve or dress, urging them to look at Papa, though as it was they never took their eyes off the couple. In the intervals of the dance, the Count, breathing deeply, waved and shouted to the musicians to play faster, 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 and faster. Lightly, and yet more lightly whirled the Count, flying round Márya Dmítrievna, now on his toes, now on his heels, until, turning his partner round to her seat, he executed the final pas, raising his soft foot backwards, bowing his perspiring head, smiling and making a wide sweep with his arm, amid a thunder of applause and laughter led by Natásha. Both partners stood still, breathing heavily and wiping their faces with their cambric handkerchiefs. "That's how we used to dance in our time, ma chère," said the Count. "That was a Daniel Cooper!" exclaimed Márya Dmítrievna, tucking up her sleeves and puffing heavily. End of chapter 20. Recorded in Nottingham, England on the 18th of July 2006 by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk.
War and Peace, Book 1, Chapter 21. Read for LibriVox.org by Miette of Miette's Bedtime Story Podcast. While in the Rostovs' ballroom, the sixth Anglaise was being danced to a tune in which the weary musicians blundered, and while tired footmen and cooks were getting the supper, Count Bezúkhov had a sixth stroke. The doctors pronounced recovery impossible. After a mute confession, communion was administered to the dying man, preparations made for the sacrament of unction, and in his house there was the bustle and thrill of suspense usual at such moments. Outside the house, beyond the gates, a group of undertakers who hid whenever a carriage drove up, waiting in expectation of an important order for an expensive funeral. The military governor of Moscow, who had been assiduous in sending aides-de-camp to inquire after the count's health, came himself that evening to bid a last farewell to the celebrated grandee of Catherine's court, Count Bezúkhov. The magnificent reception-room was crowded. Everyone stood up respectfully when the military governor, having stayed about half an hour alone with the dying man, passed out, slightly acknowledging their bows and trying to escape as quickly as from the glances fixed on him by the doctors, clergy, and relatives of the family. Prince Vasily, who had grown thinner and paler during the last few days, escorted him to the door, repeating something to him several times in low tones. When the military governor had gone, Prince Vasily sat down all alone on a chair in the ballroom, crossing one leg high over the other, leaning his elbow on his knee, and covering his face with his hand. After sitting so for a while, he rose, and, looking about him with frightened eyes, went with unusually hurried steps down the long corridor leading to the back of the house, to the room of the eldest princess. Those who were in the dimly lit reception-room spoke in nervous whispers, and, whenever anyone went into or came from the dying man's room, grew silent and gazed with eyes full of curiosity or expectancy at his door, which creaked slightly when opened. The limits of human life are fixed and may not be o'erpassed, said an old priest to a lady who had taken a seat beside him and was listening naively to his words. "I wonder, is it not too late to administer unction?" asked the lady, adding the priest's clerical title as if she had no opinion of her own on the subject. "Ah, madam, it is a great sacrament," replied the priest, passing his hand over the thin grizzled strands of hair combed back across his bald head. "Who was that? The military governor himself?" was being asked at the other side of the room. "How young-looking he is!" "Yes, and he is over 60. I hear the count no longer recognizes anyone. They wished to administer the sacrament of unction." "I knew someone who received that sacrament 7 times." The second princess had just come from the sick-room with her eyes red from weeping, and sat down beside Dr. Lorraine, who was sitting in a graceful pose under a portrait of Catherine, leaning his elbow on a table. "Beautiful," said the doctor, in answer to a remark about the weather. "The weather is beautiful, princess, and besides, in Moscow one feels as if one were in the country." "Yes, indeed," replied the princess with a sigh. "So he may have something to drink?" Lorraine considered. "Has he taken his medicine?" "Yes." The doctor glanced at his watch. "Take a glass of boiled water and put a pinch of cream of tartar," and he indicated with his delicate fingers what he meant by a pinch. "There has never been a case," a German doctor was saying to an aide de camp, "that one lifts after the third stroke." "And what a well-preserved man he was," remarked the aide de camp. "And who will inherit his wealth?" he added in a whisper. "It won't go begging," replied the German with a smile. Everyone again looked toward the door, which creaked as the second princess went in with the drink she had prepared according to Lorraine's instructions. The German doctor went up to Lorraine. "Do you think he can last till morning?" asked the German, addressing Lorraine in French, which he pronounced badly. Lorraine, pursing up his lips, waved a severely negative finger before his nose. "Tonight, not later," said he in a low voice, and he moved away with a decorous smile of self-satisfaction at being able clearly to understand and state the patient's condition. Meanwhile, Prince Vasily had opened the door into the princess's room. In this room it was almost dark. Only 2 tiny lamps were burning before the icons, and there was a pleasant scent of flowers and burnt pastilles. The room was crowded with small pieces of furniture, whatnots, cupboards, and little tables. The quilt of a high white feather bed was just visible behind the screen. A small dog began to bark. "Ah, is it you, cousin?" She rose and smoothed her hair, which was as usual so extremely smooth that it seemed to be made of one piece with her head and covered with varnish. "Has anything happened?" she asked. "I am so terrified." "No, there is no change. I only came to have a talk about business, Katish," muttered the prince, seating himself wearily on the chair she had just vacated. "You have made the place warm, I must say," he remarked. "Well, sit down, let's have a talk." "I thought perhaps something had happened," she said with her unchanging, stonily severe expression, and sitting down opposite the prince, she prepared to listen. "I wish to get a nap, mon cousin, but I can't." "Well, my dear," said Prince Vasily, taking her hand and bending it downwards as was his habit. It was plain that this "well" referred to much that they both understood without naming. The princess, who had a straight, rigid body, abnormally long for her legs, looked directly at Prince Vasily with no sign of emotion in her prominent grey eyes. Then she shook her head and glanced up at the icons with a sigh. This might have been taken as an expression of sorrow and devotion, or of weariness and hope of resting before long. Prince Vasily understood it as an expression of weariness. "And I," he said, "do you think it is easier for me? I am as worn out as a post-horse. But still I must have a talk with you, Katish, a very serious talk." Prince Vasily said no more, and his cheeks began to twitch nervously, now on one side, now on the other, giving his face an unpleasant expression which was never to be seen on it in a drawing-room. His eyes, too, seemed strange. At one moment they looked impudently sly, and at the next glanced round in alarm. The princess, holding her little dog on her lap with her thin bony hands, looked attentively into Prince Vasíli's eyes, evidently resolved not to be the first to break silence, if she had to wait till morning. "Well, you see, my dear princess and cousin, Catherine Semënovna," continued Prince Vasíli, returning to his theme, apparently not without an inner struggle, "at such a moment as this one must think of everything. One must think of the future, of all of you. I love you all like children of my own, you know." The princess continued to look at him without moving, and with the same dull expression. "And of course, my family has also to be considered," Prince Vasíli went on, testily pushing away a little table without looking at her. "You know, Katish, that you three sisters, Mamontov and my wife, are the count's only direct heirs. I know how hard it is for you to talk or think of such matters. It is no easier for me, but, my dear, I am getting on for 60 and must be prepared for anything. Do you know I have sent for Pierre? The count," pointing to his portrait, "definitely demanded that he should be called." Prince Vasíli looked questioningly at the princess, but could not make out whether she was considering what he had just said or whether she was simply looking at him. "There is one thing I constantly pray God to grant, mon cousin," she replied, "and it is that he would be merciful to him and would allow his noble soul peacefully to leave this—" Yes, of course," interrupted Prince Vasíli impatiently, rubbing his bald head and angrily pulling back toward him the little table that he had pushed away. "But, in short, the fact is, you know yourself that last winter the count made a will by which he left all his property not to us, his direct heirs, but to Pierre." "He has made wills enough," quietly remarked the princess, "but he cannot leave the estate to Pierre. Pierre is illegitimate." "But, my dear," said Prince Vasíli suddenly, clutching the little table and becoming more animated and talking more rapidly, "what if a letter has been written to the Emperor in which the count asks for Pierre's legitimation? Do you understand that in consideration of the count's services his request would be granted?" The princess smiled, as people do who think they know more about the subject under discussion than those they are talking with. "I can tell you more," continued Prince Vasíli, seizing her hand. "That letter was written, though it was not sent, and the Emperor knew of it. The only question is, has it been destroyed or not? If not, then as soon as all is over," and Prince Vasíli sighed to intimate what he meant by the words "all is over," "and the count's papers are opened, the will and letter will be delivered to the Emperor, and the petition will certainly be granted. Pierre will get everything as the legitimate son." "And our share?" asked the princess, smiling ironically, as if anything might happen, only not that. "But, my poor Katish, it is as clear as daylight. He will then be the legal heir to everything, and you won't get anything. You must know, my dear, whether the will and letter were written and whether they have been destroyed or not. And if they have somehow been overlooked, you ought to know where they are and must find them, because—" "What next?" the princess interrupted, smiling sardonically and not changing the expression of her eyes. I am a woman, and you think we are all stupid, but I know this. An illegitimate son cannot inherit. En bastard, she added, as if supposing that the translation of the word would effectively prove to Prince Vasily the invalidity of his contention. Well, really, Katish, can't you understand? You are so intelligent. How is it you don't see that if the Count has written a letter to the Emperor begging him to recognize Pierre as legitimate, it follows that Pierre will not be Pierre, but will become Count Bezyukov, and will then inherit everything under the will. And if the will and letter are not destroyed, then you will have nothing but the consolation of having been dutiful, et tout ce qui s'ensuit. That's certain. I know the will was made, but I also know that it is invalid, and you, mon cousin, seem to consider me a perfect fool, said the princess, with the expression women assume when they suppose they are saying something witty and stinging. My dear Princess Catherine Semyonovna, began Prince Vasily impatiently, I came here not to wrangle with you, but to talk about your interests as with a kinswoman, a good, true relation. And I tell you for the 10th time that if the letter to the Emperor and the will in Pierre's favour are among the Count's papers, then, my dear girl, you and your sisters are not heiresses. If you don't believe me, then believe an expert. I have just been talking to Dmitri Onufrich, the family solicitor, and he says the same. At this, a sudden change evidently took place in the princess's ideas. Her thin lips grew white, though her eyes did not change, and her voice, when she began to speak, passed through such transitions as she herself evidently did not suspect. That would be a fine thing, said she. I never wanted anything, and I don't now. She pushed the little dog off her lap and smoothed her dress. And this is gratitude, this is recognition for those who have sacrificed everything for his sake, she cried. It's splendid. Fine. I don't want anything, Prince. Yes, but you are not the only one. There are your sisters, replied Prince Vasily. But the princess did not listen to him. Yes, I knew it long ago, but had forgotten. I knew that I could expect nothing but meanness, deceit, envy, intrigue, and ingratitude, the blackest ingratitude in this house. Do you, or do you not know where that will is? Insisted Prince Vasily, his cheeks twitching more than ever. Yes, I was a fool. I still believed in people, loved them, and sacrificed myself. But only the base, the vile succeed. I know who has been intriguing. The princess wished to rise, but the prince held her by the hand. She had the air of one who has suddenly lost faith in the whole human race. She gave her companion an angry glance. There is still time, my dear. You must remember, Katish, that it was all done casually in a moment of anger, of illness, and afterwards forgotten. Our duty, my dear, is to rectify his mistake, to ease his last moments by not letting him commit this injustice, and not to let him die feeling he is rendering unhappy those who sacrificed everything for him, chimed in the princess, who would again have risen had not the prince still held her fast. Though he never could appreciate it. No, mon cousin, she added with a sigh. I shall always remember that in this world one must expect no reward, that in this world there is neither honour nor justice. In this world one has to be cunning and cruel. Now, come, be reasonable. I know your excellent heart. No, I have a wicked heart. I know your heart, repeated the prince. I value your friendship and wish you to have as good an opinion of me. Don't upset yourself, and let us talk sensibly while there is still time, be it a day or be it an hour. Tell me all you know about the will, and above all, where it is. You must know. We will take it at once and show it to the Count. He has no doubt forgotten it, and will wish to destroy it. You understand that my sole desire is conscientiously to carry out his wishes, that my only reason for being here. I came simply to help him and you. Now I see it all. I know who has been intriguing. I know, cried the princess. That's not the point, my dear. It's that protégée of yours, that sweet Princess Drubetskaya, that Anna Mikhalovna, with whom I would not take for a housemaid. The infamous, vile woman. Do not let us lose any time. Ah, don't talk to me. Last winter she wheedled herself in here and told the Count such vile, disgraceful things about us, especially about Sophie, I can't repeat them, that it made the Count quite ill, and he would not see us for a whole fortnight. I know it was then that he wrote this vile, infamous paper, but I thought the thing was invalid. We've got to do it at last. Why did you not tell me about it sooner? It's in the inlaid portfolio that he keeps under his pillow, said the princess, ignoring his question. Now I know. Yes, if I have a sin, a great sin, it is hatred of that vile woman. Almost shrieked the princess, now quite changed. And what does she come worming herself in here for? But I will give her a piece of my mind. The time will come. End of chapter 21.